I'm Tom Cochran, and I'm a nuclear physicist and an expert in the process of manufacturing nuclear weapons. I'm the director of the nuclear program at the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I've served on various boards throughout the years, including for the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I was asked in this case to analyze some of the practices at Rocky Flats. This is the Rocky Flats plant. It lies 16 miles northwest of Denver. The complex is approximately 400 acres with over 100 buildings. Building 771 began operations in 1953 as the main area where workers fashioned plutonium into nuclear bomb parts. Building 777 was another plutonium processing building. Several creeks, including North and South Walnut Creeks and Woman Creek, run through the plant grounds on their way to the Great Western Reservoir and Stanley Lake. Operated by Dow Chemical from 1953 until 1975 and by Rockwell International from 1975 until it was shut down in 1989, the plant was built to produce parts for nuclear bombs. The parts were made from plutonium, uranium, beryllium, and the plant used other hazardous materials. Although traces of plutonium occur naturally, it is to all practical purposes a man-made element, and was first identified by Dr. Glenn Seaborg in 1940. Plutonium is a heavy, radioactive, toxic metallic element. Most plutonium is so-called plutonium-239, which is one of two primary ingredients in nuclear weapons. Plutonium was not the only dangerous material handled at the plant. Rocky Flats used other radioactive and non-radioactive materials, for example, substances known as volatile organic compounds. But plutonium is the most dangerous and the one we will focus on in looking at plant management performance. People who work with plutonium know the most important thing about it is how dangerous it is. Inhaling even a minute quantity of plutonium in the form of particulates, too small to see or feel, can cause cancer. So first and foremost, plutonium must be handled safely and managed very carefully. Plutonium is also dangerous because it's pyrophoric. That is, under certain conditions, it can burst into flames spontaneously. The smoke from such a fire contains toxic plutonium oxide particles. Plutonium is more likely to ignite when it's in the form of metallic dust or filings. In making the weapon parts, the plant operators generated a great deal of plutonium filings and scrap that needed to be recycled or disposed of safely. Safe disposal is especially important because plutonium-239 has a half-life of 24,000 years. This means it takes 24,000 years for one half of the plutonium to be lost through radioactive decay. If plutonium from waste or a fire gets into the environment, it's not going away. Some of it could sink into the soil and some could be blown around by high winds, but it'll still be there and it'll affect people for thousands of years. Plutonium is very hazardous for another reason. If too much of it is brought together in one place, it can initiate a deadly nuclear chain reaction. The amount of plutonium it takes to cause an event is called a critical mass, and the resulting nuclear reaction is called a criticality event. Such an event could irradiate and kill people close by. Exactly how much plutonium causes a criticality event depends on the shape and density of the plutonium and what other materials are nearby. If it's in metallic form, as little as 2 cola cans of weapon-grade plutonium is enough to cause a criticality event. In water, it can take as little as 1/10 as much. Criticality is another reason why it's very important to control plutonium carefully, to be sure that too much plutonium doesn't accumulate in one place. The fact that it takes so little plutonium to cause a criticality event is one of the primary reasons it's used in nuclear weapons. A bomb can be made with less than 10 pounds of plutonium. It's very important to keep meticulous track of every bit of plutonium so one can be confident it hadn't fallen into the hands of terrorists or hostile foreign governments. If you were running a plant that worked with plutonium, even in 1953, you would have known all this. And because plutonium, when not handled properly, is such a huge threat to workers, to the surrounding communities and to national security, there would be important things to control: fire safety, safe disposal of waste, criticality, and inventory accounting. The U.S. nuclear weapons program, including the Rocky Flats plant, was the highest priority project of the richest nation in the world. Dow and Rockwell had the resources to do the job right. Let's examine the performance of Rocky Flats management in each of these four key areas. There were tons of plutonium on site at Rocky Flats, and tons passed through the plant every year. With that much plutonium around, a fire is a huge threat. A fire could cause a major release of plutonium into the surrounding area. Rocky Flats had many small plutonium fires every year. Any small fire can get out of control, and in 1957 one did. A huge fire erupted in Building 771, and it took over 13 hours to put it out. It was made worse by the fact that the building wasn't built to slow the spread of fire, and materials used in production areas were flammable, adding fuel to the fire and making it harder to put out. The 57 fire was a very serious incident. Documents show that fire experts studied it and told Rocky Flats management what needed to be done to improve fire safety. But Dow adopted only some of these suggestions, and some of those it did adopt, Dow undid later. Meanwhile, bomb production was increasing. More and more plutonium was used. The plant was even less safe now than it was in 1957. A partition put between two plutonium processing buildings to act as a fire break was removed, so the building was more vulnerable to fire. Another big problem had to do with the hundreds of glove boxes where employees worked with plutonium. Fire often broke out in these boxes, and they contained heat sensors to alert operators to fires. In the late 60s, material was added to the glove boxes to better shield workers from radiation. The shielding, made of a plastic called Benelex, was placed on top of the heat sensors. This configuration prevented heat transfer to the sensors, making them nearly useless in detecting fire. It would be like putting your home smoke detector outside of your house. Unfortunately, the Benelex shielding was also highly flammable. In 1969, another big plutonium fire erupted, this time in the glove boxes in Building 776. It developed into the largest industrial fire the United States had ever experienced. Even though many fires previously had broken out in Building 776, only one person was on duty in this building at the time of the fire. The fire had already spread before it was discovered. A building loaded with plutonium and containing hundreds of tons of flammable material burned out of control. Several hours into the fire, firemen noticed that the roof was getting soft and began to water it down. Had the roof collapsed, containment would have been totally lost, and plutonium-contaminated smoke released to the environment. This would have been a disaster of major proportions. According to the AEC, only the heroic efforts of the firefighters limited this burning. In hearings before Congress, a senior AEC official reported that had the fire been a little bit bigger, hundreds of square miles could have been contaminated, and the cleanup costs could have been astronomical. Some plutonium was, in fact, released from the building during the 1969 fire, although people disagree in their estimates of just how much. Most people agree, though, with the Atomic Energy Commission's assessment that only the heroism of the firefighters prevented releases from reaching catastrophic proportions. We must give the plant managers an F in fire safety. The next area to examine is the plant management's handling of contaminated waste. The plant generated managers an F in fire safety. The next area to examine is the plant management's handling of contaminated waste. The plant generated a lot of scrap during production. Scrap rich in plutonium was recycled right at the plant. Leaner residues, including contaminated machine oil, tissues, tools, and gloves that had plutonium in or on them, were often stored on site. The goal here was to find a way to recover the plutonium from these leaner residues and reuse it. Let's look at the way the plant management handled these dangerous contaminated residues. In 1958, Dow established the 903 area, an open field on the site, as an area for storing metal drums filled with machine oils contaminated with plutonium. This was started out as a temporary measure. Dow said they intended to develop a method to reclaim the plutonium from these waste oils. Within a year, the drums were corroding badly. Dow tried adding a rust inhibitor to the barrels, but the corrosion continued. To make matters worse, the drums were not properly labeled, so it was difficult to tell how old the drums were, what they contained, or how much radioactivity could have been released. 4 years after 903 area drum storage began, in a document that has since been declassified, a Dow employee reported, quote, "About 50 to 60% of these drums are badly corroded. The contents of several has already spilled out on the ground. Unless these materials are disposed of in a very near future, a serious contamination problem will develop," end quote. So by 1962, Dow knew that many barrels were leaking. But it's not until 1967, or 5 years later, that Dow began removing these radioactive drums from the field. By that time, there were more than 5,200 drums, of which over 3,500 contained plutonium. The problem was not simply that the plutonium was now on the soil on the surface of the field. Any disturbance of the soil on the pad could resuspend the plutonium particulates into the air. When the barrels were removed, the contaminated soil below was completely exposed to the winds. The high winds that are typical of this area could and did blow these particulates far off site. Let's look at Dow's attempt to clean up the 903 area. It took 1.5 years to remove the barrels from the field. Then the field sat exposed to the elements for 2 months. Next, Dow burned contaminated vegetation from the area. Again, the field sat bare and exposed for 3 more months. In November of 1968, Dow brought in heavy equipment and graded the area. As you'd expect, this kicked up a lot of radioactive dust. The lot was then allowed to sit exposed for 9 more months, when fill and then asphalt were finally applied. Dow's cleanup took nearly 3 years. Air samples show significant contamination at the time that the work was done on the 903 area. So not only did Dow create a huge mess, but in attempting to clean it up, they actually caused substantial additional releases of plutonium off-site. Since 1969, Dow and then Rockwell generated thousands of additional drums of plutonium and other radioactive residues. These drums have been stored throughout many buildings at the plant site, and most remain on site today. These residues are a catastrophe waiting to happen. Besides residues which contain plutonium and which were thought to be recoverable, the plant generated waste, often contaminated with toxic substances that had to be disposed of. In 1985, it was estimated that Rocky Flats generated an average of almost 32 million pounds of these mixed waste every year. A 1986 agreement between the Department of Energy, the EPA, and the Colorado Department of Health required Rockwell to close solar evaporating ponds that were leaking into the groundwater. These ponds had been used to evaporate water from waste liquids, and there was contaminated sludge on the bottom of the ponds. To dispose of the sludge, Rockwell decided to mix it with concrete to make a hard material they called pondcrete. They would ship the blocks to Nevada for disposal. But Rockwell never defined the process for making pondcrete. There wasn't even a formula that called for a certain amount of cement. The operators making the pondcrete just guessed at the amount. As a result, many of the blocks were not hard like concrete. They turned out to be soft like putty. In September of 1986, after some 2,000 concrete blocks had been shipped to Nevada, officials there determined that the concrete Rockwell was shipping contained materials that the Nevada site was not authorized to store. The officials immediately stopped accepting the concrete. Rockwell's response was to store the blocks outdoors on the 750 pad. The concrete was packaged in plastic-lined tri-wall cardboard boxes. These boxes were completely inappropriate for outdoor storage of concrete. During this time, there's no evidence that Rockwell management made any backup plans or changes in procedure. The company continued to make semi-soft 1,200-pound blocks containing contaminated waste and to store them in cardboard boxes outside, protected only by tarps that frequently blew off in the high wind. By the end of September 1987, there were over 10,000 cardboard boxes of concrete on the 750 pad. Running out of room, Rockwell began to use the 904 pad as well. Not surprisingly, given these conditions, the boxes began to deteriorate. In May of 1988, a box fell and broke open on the 904 pad. Environmental samples taken soon after showed contamination. In the year and a half between the halting of the shipments to Nevada and the 1988 spill, more than 16,500 blocks were produced and stored in cardboard boxes outdoors. The Department of Energy determined that 9,000 boxes stored outdoors had deteriorated. It will cost hundreds of millions of dollars to clean up this radioactive mess. There's an almost identical story about Rockwell's handling of salt waste. That product was called saltcrete, and it was also poorly made, inappropriately packaged and stored outside, and it also leaked. The examples of extreme mishandling of waste go on and on. Rockwell knowingly misused the 1952 sewage treatment plant and routinely discharged chemicals into the effluent. They knew their system ultimately fed into local communities' drinking water, and yet they continued these practices. Later, Rockwell pleaded guilty to criminal violation of federal environmental laws in each of the concrete, saltcrete, and sewage treatment matters. The 903 pad incident and the violations to which Rockwell pled guilty demonstrate reckless and criminal handling of radioactive waste. Unfortunately, they are not the only examples. Throughout the plant's history, Dow and Rockwell buried, stored, and spilled radioactive and other dangerous waste at the site. Dangerous waste leaked into the soil. This map shows where the known waste sites are today, but no one can say where this waste will go in the future. One reason is that Rocky Flats is the home of many thousands of gophers and other animals and to millions of ants and other insects. These animals dig into the ground and churn up the soil. In most environments, this animal activity is natural and healthy. At Rocky Flats, it can bring deadly nuclear contaminants to the surface where winds can resuspend them. So, as in the past, the radioactivity from nuclear waste buried in hotspots will spread far beyond the plant's boundaries in years and decades to come. Because of poor waste management practices, radioactive contamination was released into the environment. What's more, the site is still crowded with waste accumulated and mismanaged during 37 years of Dow and Rockwell control. These wastes, dumped or stored in barrels throughout the site and buried and leaking into the soil, continue to threaten nearby communities. The grade for waste management is clearly an F. A third key area that must be completely controlled in the operation of a plant like Rocky Flats is that of criticality. Remember that if too much plutonium accumulates in one place, a deadly nuclear reaction can occur. This reaction, or criticality event, can result in a lethal radiation dose to everyone nearby. In 1989, a firm called Scientech was hired by the Department of Energy to study criticality safety at Rocky Flats. The team reported that they found several kilograms of plutonium in exhaust ducts in Building 771. That's enough plutonium to cause a criticality event under certain conditions. Before the study, plant managers assured that there wasn't such a plutonium buildup at the plant, but a former employee had specifically suggested exhaust ducts as a probable location for plutonium buildup. and the study team found indications of plutonium in other ducts as well. In addition, the team found about 16,000 gallons of plutonium residue stored in barrels in the basement with a broken sump pump, no water level alarms, and no radiation alarms. There were watermarks on the walls and on the barrels showing that it had flooded in the past. The Scientech team found that this combination of factors was unacceptable in terms of risk of criticality, because if flooding were to occur, for example from a broken pipe, a criticality event might occur. They also found residue drums in storage, stacked up high on shelves but not restrained. The team found that in an earthquake the drums could fall off their shelves, which could result in a criticality accident. In addition to these specific problems, the team reviewed 600 procedural infractions under Dow and Rockwell going back almost 30 years. The Scientech team judged that there was complacency and poor communication on safety matters. They found 8 serious infractions that cut the margin of safety unacceptably close. The team also reported that the plant didn't follow DOE safety guidelines, that there should be, during normal operations, at least 2 barriers to prevent a criticality accident. Finally, the team reported that employees seemed afraid to raise their concerns to their own supervisors. In their report, which covered both the Dow and Rockwell eras, the team concluded, quote, "The team is not satisfied with criticality safety practices or with the understanding of nuclear safety standards by the workers in the plant," end quote. For criticality, Rocky Flats management gets a D. The only reason it's not an F is that fortunately no uncontrolled criticality event is known to have occurred there. The final area of management performance we will examine is inventory control. Plutonium is both valuable and dangerous. It is important to know how much plutonium is on site and where it is at all times. This takes meticulous inventory control. As a key ingredient in nuclear weapons, plutonium is far too dangerous to lose track of. To keep track of plutonium, the plant is supposed to record how much plutonium is shipped in, how much is inside the plant, and how much is shipped out in either weapon parts or in waste. Just as with your checking account, the numbers should balance. When the numbers do not balance, the difference is said to be material unaccounted for, or MUF for short. There are 5 places where this MUF can be. The first place the MUF could have been lost is in the waste. Second is bookkeeping or measurement errors. Someone forgot to count the plutonium or wrote down the wrong number. A third possibility is theft. Fourth, MUF could be accumulated in ducts, pipes, or other places. And fifth, the missing material could have been released into the environment, for example from a fire or from improper storage like at the 903 pad. Dow and Rockwell did a poor job of keeping track of plutonium. As a result, there are now some 2,600 pounds of plutonium unaccounted for. That's enough for nearly 400 nuclear weapons. No one can reconstruct exactly where the MUF went. Plant management gets an F in inventory control. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, plutonium was not the only hazardous material handled at the plant. As indicated in this document, there were thousands of chemicals used at the Rocky Flats plant, many in substantial quantities. Some of these materials pose potential hazard to workers and to the environment if not handled with caution. One class of such chemicals is called volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. These chemicals are not radioactive but are still very toxic. Some are poisonous and some cause cancer. Huge quantities of VOCs were used at Rocky Flats to clean equipment. Plant management did not control emissions or disposal, and most of 2 to 7 million gallons of VOCs used each year ended up in the environment. In the nearly 40 years of Rocky Flats operations, plant management failed time and time again in the way they handle these dangerous substances. Their failure has led to the release of plutonium and other radioactive dangerous substances into the environment outside of the plant boundaries. As was known to Dow and Rockwell, thousands of people live in close proximity to the plant. It's difficult to estimate with certainty how much plutonium was released to the environment, though some certainly was. The releases are especially serious given that inhalation of even a minute quantity of plutonium is dangerous, and given that any plutonium released will be radioactive for tens of thousands of years. Everybody agrees that plutonium has escaped from the plant into the off-site environment. They just disagree about how much has been released. Scientists from the Department of Energy drew these contour lines to show which areas they concluded were most contaminated. The areas within the contours closest to the plant received the most contamination. The areas within the contours furthest from the plant the least. The contour line in the middle has been used to help define the classes in this litigation. The plutonium releases were preventable. For example, drums of contaminated waste should never have been left in an unprotected outdoor location like the 903 area. But even if they were put there, proper labeling, protecting the drums from the weather, good monitoring of the drums, and taking action when it was first discovered that the drums were leaking would have made a difference. These simple and common sense measures were not taken. Instead, Dow allowed the leaking drums to remain in place for years, leading to significant release of plutonium off-site. Regardless of how much got out or where it is now, about half of that released plutonium will still be in the environment 24,000 years from now. In 1989, the FBI raided Rocky Flats because they suspected that Rockwell was violating laws about the disposal of hazardous waste. After the raid, the plant was shut down and Rockwell was replaced as contractor. Since 1989, the government has employed EG&G and later Kaiser Hill to manage Rocky Flats. They've barely begun the task of cleaning up the plutonium mess that was allowed to accumulate for nearly 40 years. No one knows precisely how much plutonium is at the plant or where it all is. DOE itself has estimated that there's still over 28,000 pounds of deadly plutonium at Rocky Flats, some of it in unstable form. As we saw with the 903 pad, the cleanup itself could trigger additional substantial releases. An earthquake could cause a fire and a catastrophic release. Another fire could cause additional releases of plutonium into the nearby neighborhoods. A serious fire could cause a catastrophic release and contaminate hundreds of square miles with astronomical cleanup costs. This threat, unfortunately, will be with us for a long time. This is the legacy of decades of negligence and mismanagement at Rocky Flats.